3, 2, 1.
Bingo.
Nancy says we're live, so if she says we're live, we're ready to go. Certainly thankful for those who are here tonight, braving the elements of a rainy, nasty day to come and study the Word of God as we're continuing on in Lesson 2 of the Song of Solomon. Certainly we'll lift up those in prayer for those who couldn't be here tonight. We know there's a bunch out sick, under the weather, literally under the weather tonight. But certainly we're thankful that people can follow us along on Facebook and YouTube as well. And I want it to be like, when you turn on Charles Stanley, when he comes on, he always comes bolting up, and he comes up to the lectern. I was going to do that, just start coming running, but we won't do it tonight. Lesson 2. As last week we were introduced to this unique book, and I love the responses that everybody said. It's a little bit different. And yes, it is a little bit different when you're used to studying narrative, like the Old Testament or narrative and the Gospels of Luke, and then, of course, even Revelation and prophecy. You have to remember you are studying one of the wisdom literatures. Remember when we did Proverbs, and Brother Louis Piner was with us, and Louis said, it's kind of hard to teach. He says, it's kind of like buckshot. It was all over the place, trying to get a grasp on it. And then Psalms that Terry wanted us to do was hard too, because how do you really get your picture around somebody just putting their thoughts to music and that? And of course, Ecclesiastes was the same. So why should we expect any different on the Song of Solomon? But one thing about it, we learned how to deal with relationships. As last week, we were introduced to the author, the lover, also known as Solomon, and his girlfriend, fiancée, soon-to-be wife, the Shulamite. So we'll talk about that as we get started in a few minutes. But I will certainly open us up with prayer, and we'll get started. Father, once again, we thank you for the privilege it is to be in your house, to break your word out and study it. We thank you for each one who's here, who's not only taken time out of a busy week to come, but overcome the obstacles that the enemy would throw at them, whether it be weather, sickness, just lethargy, even apathy to an extent. Thank you for each one who's come out tonight. Thank you for those who are following along on Facebook and then YouTube. We thank you for that technology. Thank you for those not only here, but in all around who follow along. We ask that everything we'd say and do tonight would glorify you. Personally, I'd ask that you speak through me, because I can't do it on my own. I need you to speak through me. And we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. So last week, this was written by Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived. And we said it was really the Song of Songs that he wrote. He wrote 1,005 songs. That's pretty good, Nancy, to write that many songs. Of course, Nancy was playing the piano, for those who weren't here, and I told her she was my favorite piano player. And she said, no, you're not. Michael W. Smith is. And I said, okay, how about if I say my local piano player? But anyway, writing songs that people like Michael W. Smith would do. He wrote 1,005, but this was his Song of Songs. And as we were introduced last week to yearning and dreaming of a perfect love, we met the Shulamite, a young lady who Solomon, who one time was touring his kingdom, went up in the Lebanese mountain area and ran into a woman who was drop-dead gorgeous. She was named as the Shulamite. She was from that area. We don't know her personal name, but we know that from her. And he had such an effect on her that she spent the first 8 verses yearning and pontificating of her love and her desire to be with her lover boy here, other than the king, the lover, Solomon. But when she was in part of doing that, she came to some problems. She says, well, I'm a little bit different. How am I going to be able, I'm a country girl. How am I going to live in the palace, in the city life? Look at me, I'm darker than the rest of these other girls who were here, because we know. And then later on, she told us why she was darker. We said it's not a race thing. This was, during that time period, it wasn't the fit thing to be tan, like everybody loves now to be sprayed or get a tanning booth or hang out in the sun. She'd been out in the sun and she was darker and was seen as maybe not as good as those around her. And so she said, I've not been able to take care of myself because I've been out working. And so we began to see a little bit of banter back and forth between the two of them as she was worried about herself and he was trying to, well, actually we haven't really heard him speak yet. He's going to speak tonight. and is going to talk about how beautiful she was. And then we got a little bit of insight into the women who were around her, the third part of this party, which we said was the women who were in the palace, the girls of Jerusalem, women of Jerusalem, depending on what version you have, who kind of was a little catty towards her and said, if you're worried about where he's at, you better get right, because, hey, if you can't run with the big dogs, you stay on the porch. So that was really all of last week summed up in about 5 minutes. But tonight we're going to move on into what they call the language of love. And if I move a little faster than that, we might move into the next section. But we're going to pick up reading 1 through 14. Does anybody want to read? Or I have it in front of me if nobody wants to read. Nancy will read 1 through 14.
Sons were angry with me. They made me caretaker of the vineyards. But I have not taken care of my own vineyard. Tell me, O you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? Where do you make it lie down at noon? Or why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? If you yourself do not know, most beautiful among women, go forth on the trail of the flock and pasture your young goats by the tents of the shepherds. To me, my darling, you are like my mare among the chariots of Pharaoh. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, your neck with strings of beads. We will make for you ornaments of gold with beads of silver. While the king was at his table, my perfume gave forth its fragrance. My beloved is to me a pouch of myrrh which lies all night between my breasts. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-gedi.
And that's the word of God for the people of God. And now I'm going to try to make sense of all that Nancy just read. Certainly, may God bless the reading of His word and hopefully the exposition of it. As we said last week, really, she began with her yearning and desire for her love. She was in love with this guy. She was smitten, I guess is the way we would use today, and was desiring to be with him and wanted to follow him and go everywhere he was at and be in his presence, the way it is when you got puppy love, And I love the commentary. It says, maybe love makes the world go round, but miscommunication makes marriages go round and round. Take the case of Vladimir and his wife Rosina from Germany. According to CNN's news report, the older couple who were married could not see eye to eye. What made this couple a little unique, however, was the creativity used by Vladimir. He was 73 years old in making his point when he needed to get it to his wife. Well, his side of the story was that his wife would never let him get a word in edgewise. Once she got warmed up, she simply continued the verbal. Therefore, whenever she would get that way, he would bring out, now guys, listen to this, an air raid siren. You know those things? So every time he wanted to get a word in and she was, he would blow that thing. Well, who knows where he found it, but it worked quite well. That would get your attention, wouldn't it? When he was ready to do the talking, he would turn on the machine, and then even she got the point. He said, quote, I'd crank up the siren and let it rip for a few minutes. It worked every time. Afterward, it got real quiet. Well, the neighbors, you can imagine, weren't nearly as impressed. What do you think they did? They called the police. And soon that 220-volt wartime air raid siren had been confiscated and made part of the police. My mind's going blank. The police locker. Although all his wife would say after this was, my husband is a stubborn mule, so I have to get loud. So we see the idea of communication is important. Not only, one of the things I've stepped back and said we need to get across, this is not just relationships with, romantic relationship, but also it can be between family members, personal matters, and certainly, ultimately, we're going to see some of these relationships with the Lord. One good woman also told, just talking about Miss, you got to have some comic relief in this. One good woman also told the writer of the book that was taking notes on this, said, well, I had to leave one day to get some urgent errands around dinner time. So I cooked this delicious casserole for my husband. I set it in the oven and set on the timer. I quickly scrawled a note, left it on the kitchen table where he would see it. The note read, "Dinner is in the oven," end quote. I got in the car and left to take care of the appointments. Well, when she returned, she was surprised to find him sitting kind of suddenly, maybe pouting, in the family room. And guess what he was eating? A peanut butter and jelly sandwich. And he reached in and had a few stale potato chips that he found in the back of the pantry. He didn't seem very happy, she said. I checked in the kitchen, and there was the casserole dish, still in the oven, untouched. What was going on? It was his favorite dish. She said, "Didn't you see my note?" "Yeah, I sure did. I got your message. Dinner is over." Suddenly, wife understood it cut legibility accounts in handwriting as well as in conversation as well. He thought dinner was over, and she said it was in the oven. Just like the girls at the office will tell me, sometimes you need to write so we can understand what you're saying. So anyway, communication is what we're trying to get across, is the key to every successful relationship, marriage, family, whatever it could be. We know we're not saying anything new when we talk about communication. It's like saying that the bad weather is going to cause you some inconvenience during the year. We know that's true. So whatever our problem is when it comes to relationships, a lot of times it happens in communication, whether it's decibels that we can't hear or legibles that we can't understand. Communication is certainly something that was clear. Why are you telling us all this, Rodney? Because that's the idea of this little section, is the language of love, is being able to get across to the people that we're in love with or the people that we are in relationship with what we're trying to say. Now, one of the things as we begin that Nancy read in verse 9 is now Solomon is beginning to speak to the Shulamite. This is really the first time that he said anything, and if you have one of those Bibles that has these sections broken down, sometimes it'll say she and he. This is the first time that in ESV, one that I've got in my coffers here, that we see he. So he is finally going to speak. All of last week it was really her talking, and then the daughters of Jerusalem. And she had been worried a little bit about what life would be like married to him, that she was a little different than those others, and could she do it? And now he begins to reassure her of just how much she means to him. Now, one of the things that we're going to learn, if you're taking notes, you put level 1. When it comes to the language of love, we need to learn to be personal with our praise of our spouse or the people. Not only does it be a loved one, it can be people that maybe are children, grandchildren, who, it's always good to hear some kind of positive encouragement. So we need to be personal about it. We really can't show our love towards somebody without the principle of praise. In chapter 1, now he's going to get a little personal with her. One of the things we need to do is he wants to let her know she is going to be loved. And that his praise about her is very personal. He says, "And I compare you, my love." Some calls her, the ESV says love. Does anybody have anything different there in verse 9? I compare you, my darling. I think one of the commentaries said darling. My darling. My love, my darling. It could be either one, but you can tell the personalness. He's my love. And don't we hopefully call our spouses that? Our love, honey. Angie's back there laughing. I remember Ralph used to call Betty my honey and all that, We have these pet names, so it's personal. He says, I compare you, my love, to, now I don't recommend any of us telling anybody this, comparing your wife to a horse. But we're going to talk about it in the context it was written. It's not just, he's not calling her a horse, he's making a comparison. But now he's speaking, and he's going to talk in country terms, and what is under the hand. We recall her intensity about worried about her physical appearance, and certainly as compared to others. And so now he is sensitive to how she's feeling and wants to build her up in a genuine praise and encouragement. And the first thing he tells her is she's loved. Now, love, as we've learned, never goes without saying. And I remember one of the commentaries I read said, you can tell a lot of people a lot of things, but you really can never tell somebody you love them too much. If you think about it. I mean, you could never really tell about it. And so he wants to get it across, I love you. Now, guys, a little more so than probably ladies, avoid the subject of talking and using language to impress those that we love. Now, Solomon begins to compare in his love, or darling, he says, to my filly among Pharaoh's chariots, or mare. Now, Dr. Jeremiah says, listen, I don't know about you, but I'm going to go out on a limb and assume that your loved one certainly won't appreciate being compared to a horse. But we know, Rusty mentioned it in one of his, I think he mentioned it the other night, you got to pay attention to who your audience is. He's not writing to 2022. He's writing to the love of his life, and according to the people who will be writing here in this song. Remember, he's got it. I don't know if he's got a ukulele out and playing or the piano, but he's going to put this to song, and he's putting it into things that they understood and he understands. He calls her my love or my darling, and that is timeless. Now, maybe there's what age you live in. If you call somebody your love or your darling, there's some endearment there. I love it. One size fits all situations. And so we hear Solomon use this term of endearment 8 more times in this entire book. So he thinks a lot of her. So we step back and remember, this lady has been treated poorly by her brethren. Why did she say that? Because they were angry with her and made her stand out and do manual labor in the fields. And so his feelings are, I want to make sure when you marry me, I'm going to make sure you're in a nice place. I'm going to take care of you, and everything's going to be fine. You don't have anything to worry about. So he's looking at her and wants to make sure she's understanding that. Well, what about this idea about being compared to a mare or a filly? Well, let's talk about what that is. In the days of Solomon, a horse was not just seen as a beast of burden. It was a symbol of royalty. The king had the best stallions, usually, and fillies in the entire land, and they were there as something that he would use not only for transportation, but certainly to show off. Sort of like maybe a Cadillac today, or a Mercedes, or BMW, whatever you drive. Now, we know that Solomon loved horses. How do we know that? Somebody want to read 1 Kings chapter 10, 26 through 29. We're going to find out just how much Solomon loved horses. Now, there's some of us that really love horses today, but let's tell you a little bit about what Solomon did. Anybody got that? 1 Kings 10, 26 through 29. Anybody gets it? Read it. 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 26 through 29. 29.
Got it.
Wait.
1 Kings 10, 26, 29.
Yeah.
Okay. And Solomon gathered together chariots and horsemen. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horsemen, whom he stationed in the chariot cities and with the king in Jerusalem. And the king made silver as common in Jerusalem as stone, and he made cedar as plentiful as the sycamore of the Sheplah. And Solomon's import of horses was from Egypt and Cush, and the king's traders received them from Cush at a price. A chariot could be imported from Egypt for 600 shekels of silver, and a horse for 150. And so through the king's traders, they were exported to all the kings of the Hittites and the kings of Syria.
So, he just read that Scripture tells us that he had 1,400 chariots. Now, it takes a few horses to pull the chariot, and he had 12,000 horsemen. Well, I'm going to tell you that taking care of 2 or 3 horses is a full-time job. But let me tell you, he had 12,000 horsemen. So you can just imagine 12,000, maybe 20,000 horses. How about those stables, guys? He loved horses. One of the other things that one of the other commentaries talked about that we'll really talk about next week, Solomon loved nature. He was one of the first people that began to see animals as a botanist and a zoologist. And we remember talking a little bit about it when we did Ecclesiastes. But certainly, it's no small operation that Solomon loved his horses. And Bill just read, he imported them from all over the world. So he probably just didn't have quarter horses and walking horses and Belgians and Persians. He had them from all over the world, Arabians and horses. So he had a taste. And he had a discerning taste in his stallions that were bought, that Bill just read, for a great price from Egypt. So they were imported. Now, a fine horse would bring about 150 shekels at the time, which was a considerable sum. So the art of the chariot worked this way. Why are you telling us all this, Rodney? Because I want to know why he's calling her his filly. There would be a team of stallions that pulled the cart or the chariot. And they were powerful, sleek, and strong. But if you know a lot about those horses, they were not natural leaders. They kind of wanted to go off on their own. That's why they had to put bridles and bits on them, right? Therefore, a harness team would be led by what we call, quote, a boss mare. You can guess why if you know horses. Well, you think those stallions, they weren't interested in following another stallion. They were looking at that mare. Little story, I remember when we first bought Socks. He hadn't been gelded too long at the time, and we were boarding him at Newport. Put a saddle on him, and there was some fillies next door. Where do you think he headed at? Wide open, headed towards the fence. The saddle wasn't too tight. When he jerked and headed that way, guess where I went? Right off the side. But you see what they would do is they'd put these powerful stallions up front pulling the chariot, and to keep them following, they'd put the mare out front, and these stallions would follow the mare, and they would pull the chariot. They had an eye for the fine-looking filly up front and center when she took off. Now think back to what Solomon is comparing his beloved to. He compares her to the beautiful mare that runs with the stallions. She's a lovely woman in a world of men. She's special. She's worthy of pursuit. So we see, now when you step back and see why he calls her that, he's calling her, you're the most beautiful thing in the world, and everybody has eyes for you. And you are my mare among the chariots. She's worthy of this special praise that he described. Not the words that we would say today, guys. But in those days, he was building her up as one who was different and a little bit higher to overcome all of the things that she had been saying. Because remember, she's been saying, I'm too dark. I'm not going to be able to make it. And how am I going to deal with these catty women who are telling me all these things? And he says, honey, you ain't got anything to worry about. You're my filly among all the stallions. What will we'd say? You're one in a million today, baby. So we see right off the bat, his words finally comes out of her. And he wants to do that. So the idea of speech and personal praise certainly falls away. Dr. Jeremiah talked about, he says, what is the ratio of times that we say, I love you sometimes, to say, did you take the trash out? Did you feed the dogs? The bill's been paid. The more time you spend, and you spend in the longer marriage, the idea of the romantic talking back and, oh, I love you, and you're sweet, you're beautiful, kind of fades away to the average, ordinary days of things that are going on. Solomon wants us to know that, sometimes the language of love still needs to be there. And in his idea, it was easy to lift her up and tell her how beautiful she was. And his way of doing it was comparing her. She was his filly among the stallions. She was different. She was special. She was beautiful, and everybody was chasing after her. Howard Hendricks, who was a professor at the Dallas Seminary down in Dallas, Texas, used to talk about a Bible study that he led with the Dallas Cowboys back in the years when they won all the Super Bowls. When Dr. Hendricks visited the locker room, there was one of the 6-foot, 350-pound linemen who was having some marital problems. And he says, I took him aside for some marital counseling. He says, one of the first questions I asked him was, do you ever tell your wife you love her? He said, I told her I loved her on our wedding day, and that stands until I revoke it. Now, you can tell why there were some problems in that marriage, right? The word I love you needs to come out, and it needs to be placed out there when it needs to go, when people need it. Sometimes a fitting word He'll shake his head. Oh, a fit word spoken at a right time. Or as that popular song was written back in the 1980s, find 10,000 ways to say I love you. So the idea that Solomon tells us that we come from this and supposed to learn is the language of love tells us that we are to praise our spouse. Now I'm going to sit back and extrapolate that to something else. I'd say that even with your children, your grandchildren, the other people that you're in relationships with, they need to be told personally and encouraged. You know, we've heard, when I took psychology classes back at Chapel Hill, they would always say the idea of positive reinforcement. I mean, if somebody continues as a whole, you're never going to be any good, you're not as smart as your brother, and just continually tears you down, it doesn't build you up as his personal encouragement. Well, you did good, I'm proud of you. I think you can extrapolate and say the power of word of praise works not only in our love relationships, as Solomon has here, but also in our personal relationships. So he not only begins now by talking about personal with his praise, he tells her she's loved, he also tells her that she's lovely. You ever noticed how much more believable a story is when you give details? Now, there's some of us that, our professions give us a lot of details, and some people can say in one word what some of us take 15 words to say. We're wordy. When you make a statement and then fill in the blanks, it really adds to what's going on. What do you love about your spouse? What do you love about your child, your grandchild, your cousin, your friend, whoever it is? Obviously, you say, well, I love everything about them. But really, being more specific is something that works better. And here is Solomon's example. He's already told her, you're my filly among my mares. But now he gets specific and tells what he thinks is lovely about her. Your cheeks are lovely with ornaments, and your neck with chains of gold. So that's verse 10. So he begins now to say, focusing on her beauty. Now, doesn't everyone want to be told they're beautiful or handsome? Solomon observes that and wants to make sure that her self-esteem is built up. Remember, she'd been worried about what she looked like. And now he's telling her, not only am I filly, but you are beautiful. And he begins to say, what do I think? Your cheeks are beautiful. Pleasing words that he's talking about it. Now, one of the things we step back to also his idea of thinking about horses. Chariot horses, you see, were dressed and decorated with lost my place here. Accordingly, with the royal, because they were royal horses, they would braid their hair and their manes with jewelry, and then they would put on their bridles with different jewel-filled colors and all the different. So they were really fixed up and braided, and everything was made beautiful. So when they would make their way through the streets, obviously if it was during the day, the sun would reflect off the beautiful jewels and all that, and then everybody would run out to see this beautiful set of horses coming down the streets. It was kind of a pageant or a pageantry when the king would come through with his stallions, and they were all dressed up. So Solomon really picks up on that imagery of what he understood about the beauty of how they decorated the horses, but what really behind it was behind the scenes, that natural beauty. And now as he begins to talk about your cheeks and your neck are lovely. He notices that those things are there, but that's not what his focus is on, is the natural beauty of her face and her cheeks. He wants to make sure that she realizes that she is beautiful, and it was not her trappings that made her beautiful, it was her natural beauty. And as I said, doesn't everybody want to be told they're beautiful or handsome? Gary Chapman, in his book, The 5 Love Languages, says, if you try writing your expressions down on paper and take the best shots and then give it to your wife or your loved ones, we have learned through the years to endure the art of letter writing that our great-grandparents enjoyed, and we've forgotten that written expressions can be saved and cherished. If you think about it, when you were younger, what do we people like to do? Love notes. I remember back when, it's been a long time ago, I would send Angie letters to the mail and talk about what's going on. And then, people back earlier than that would send, the military people would be across the sea, and they would send letters to their loved ones. He says, the idea of writing down how we feel about people is kind of left now. Now what do we do? And there's something to be said for writing it that way. The idea of writing down what we feel and that really love about the other person. And the words are reflected. And Solomon was no different at this time. He was telling you, you are my beauty. And the thing that I notice about you is how beautiful your cheeks are and how lovely the ornaments hang on them. And he begins to talk about her neck, how beautiful her neck is. He notices every single thing about her. And I said, we can step back and say, well, not only do we say that about the people that we love, but we say it about other people that we need to encourage. Maybe it's not their physical beauty. Maybe it's something else that's in their lives that they need to be encouraged about to build them up. Because everyone needs to be a Barnabas and be an encourager. I pray every day to be an encourager and not a discourager. Or one of those people that brighten a room when they enter, not when they leave. You know what I mean? So certainly. Well, here's another reason, another thing that Solomon does. He says, always be personal with your praise. Be personal with the person so they know you're talking about it. Here's one, go public with your praise. This is a little bit difficult, but you see it. And the commentary says, have you ever seen that guy at the office or at work or somewhere who's surrounded by coworkers and his wife calls on the phone and the guy at the end of the conversation, yeah, me too, is obviously what she said to him, right? I love you. And to keep from, I was laughing, at Cherry Point, right? Oh, me too. Instead of saying, oh, I love you too. Oh, I'm not as much of a manly man. I said, he may actually say it at home, but doesn't want to say it in front of other people. Well, guess what? Solomon didn't have a problem with it. He was going public with it. Put it out there. And now he begins to shift. If you look at the way the language is written, he's been saying, I compare you, and your cheeks are. Now he begins to say, we will make for you ornaments of gold, studded with silver. Now he begins to go public. It goes from I to we. And he's involving other people in how beautiful she is and how much he loves her. Back to Gary Chapman, who wrote this book, he says, I suggest some things. He says, praise your spouse to a third party or to a friend. Maybe it's not your spouse or your lover, who it may be. He says, why would we praise that particular person to a third party? Because when the word gets back to the person we're trying to impress, it's always going to be greater than it is when we say it. How does that know? Because if I tell Nancy a secret, by the time it gets all the way back to Bill, guess what? It's not going to be the same thing I told him. Everybody's shaking their head. You see what Gary Chapman was saying here? When we talk about how much we love this person, or how beautiful they are, or how good they are, or how smart they are, it's always going to get magnified by the time it comes back to the person. He even tells one a little bit better. He says, husbands, if your wife's mother is still alive, tell her. And when it gets back to your wife, it's going to be exaggerated 10 times from your mother-in-law to what it was to everybody else. But anyway, what we're saying here is the things that we say about each other, the things we do, we can do it publicly and bring it to that person's attention, and it certainly adds to the love of the relationship. And Solomon's doing the same thing here. He's responding to her. If you remember the song Amazing Grace, written by John Newton. I remember when we studied the Amazing Grace, and Paul had written on it, and we're talking about some things from Romans on it, and he talked about, John Newton, remember, was a slave trader. He was about as bad as you can get, and he's turned his life over to the Lord, and obviously wrote one of the greatest hymn that was ever written. But he said, he made some wonderful remarks about his wife, and I'm like, why couldn't I have thought about that? He says, every room where my wife Mary is looks like it's unfurnished. Now let me tell you something. He's telling it like it is. How you know what he's talking about? He says, when I go into a room and my wife is not there, it's like the room is unfurnished. Now he's getting the goodies there on that. Winston Churchill, remember him, certainly found a way to say personal praise to his wife. One night at a banquet, he was sitting next to his wife, Clemmy, when he was asked a question. If you could be anybody else but yourself, who would you choose to be? He grabbed Clemmy's hand and said, if I couldn't be who I am, I would most like to be Lady Churchill's second husband. Now that's laying it out thick. The author of his biography says, that night the old fella scored some points with her. But the idea, we're telling these things, as I said, to be laughing and to carry you got to have some humor to this, is the idea of praise. And Solomon is praising the Shulamite in the language of love that we've been talking about, because he wants to make sure that she's built up and she knows exactly how much he loves her. Well, let me tell you, it also works the other way, because we need to learn to apply this. The things that we say in the presence of other people could be devastating to relationships. Dr. Jeremiah tells the story. He said, I remember on occasion, Donna and I were on a way to build, we were building this capital campaign to build one of the church buildings. And we had a formal dinner that night at Fort Wayne, Indiana. And the church leaders and the committee members were all present. And after a fine dinner, we were kind of standing around when one of the wives approached us. And she told her husband, we've got a babysitter. We need to leave pretty soon. He turned around and replied to her in front of everybody, well, if you want to go home, you just start walking. Dr. Jeremiah said it felt like the air had been left out of the room. People were shocked. And he said, I can tell you after 30 years, I can remember how hurt she looked in her face, and I bet how angry she was. So the idea is the words we say mean something, especially to those that we love, but also to family. I want to keep reminding people, this idea can also be to children, grandchildren, friends, family members, church members that we're in contact with. The things we say publicly is usually built to build those up, like Solomon, but it also can work the opposite. Be careful what you say in public. The next thing he says is be passionate with your praise. We need to be personal. We need to be passionate in the things he says. We know we've got to get back to that. Now we begin to shift back to her. She's talked about how much she's waiting for the love of her life. Was a little worried about could she do it. He's responded, honey, nothing to worry about. You're the love of my life. He's praised her. It's time for her to respond. Remember, this is the language of love back and forth. The passion that comes with our speech to others is the fizz and the cola when it comes to love, the things we say. There's a way to say, I love you. And there's a way to say, I love you. You know what I mean? How do we say it? How do we do these would, do we say it with meaning and say it, or do we say it just to be saying it? In the biblical passage that we're getting ready to move in now, we said Solomon has been speaking words of love to good old Shulamite, but now she begins to do, and we're having almost like a mutual admiration challenge here. One to try to outdo the other when it comes to talking about it. It's almost like a contest to outdo. So Solomon spoke his love, Shulamite does, and now we have this little banner back and forth. Now, Gordon MacDonald, in his commentary, writes, he says, in this little passage that we're reading now, we're getting ready to talk about, these are two people whose emotions are so swelled that words are inadequate to express what they feel towards the other person. And they've got to resort to images and the beauty of different things and strength or the taste of fruit to understand how much they love one another. Are we any different today? I love you better than Peter loves the Lord, we hear people say today, right? Or, you're sweeter than honey. We do the same thing. Gordon says, suddenly I realize why a man may call his wife honey or baby. A loving couple begins early in the relationship to develop a private vocabulary. Everybody's thinking back to when we were younger, the little pet names that we called each other. Some of those things we would never disclose to the outside world. Those words that have significance with only those two people understand. Everybody's smiling so you know exactly what we're talking about. Now, not all couples develop a private love vocabulary, but majority do. Dr. Jeremiah says, before Donna and I were married, I was off in seminary and I was studying the Greek language. One day I come home and I told Donna, I love her in Greek. Now, he says that language, the coinage Greek, that really is not in there. She was fascinated, and she wanted to learn how to say it herself. And he said, I had fun teaching her how to pronounce it. And to this very day, sometimes we come up and speak to each other and say, I love you in Greek. He said, not only does nobody else know that, my children didn't even know that. But certainly we know that. We have these little pet names that we call people. And the reason why he said it is, that's exactly what these two people were doing. They're bantering back and forth with the love and devotion they have one for one another. Now, the passion that we speak and the passion is going to be very strong in this next few verses that we're going to talk about, because she begins now to show her display of affection towards the man that she loves. And in verse 12, he says, while my king was on his couch, some version has the table, my nard, some verses have, or my spikenard sends forth its fragrance. Now, that word spikenard or nard should put some bells off in your memory. to something that happened back in the New Testament. I'm going to get to that in a minute. It's sort of a perfume. It's not like what we would say today. Angie was looking at one last night. What was it? Dior that they sell. I don't know. I don't know the female version. I know that we have Ralph Lauren, and we have Allure, and all those different kinds. But this particular kind of spikenard or kind of perfume they had was called nard, and it was derived from a plant native to the Himalayan region. So we know all of a sudden a high elevation in India area. And it grew about 11,000 to 17,000 feet above sea level. In ancient times, only the rich could afford it. For one thing, it don't grow in your backyard, because hey, unless you're living in 17,000 elevation, you're not going to get it. And most people didn't have the money to go pay people to go get it. So it was very valuable. Even today, according to commentary, it's available and costly, but it's very pungent. And it has a warm, earthly aroma that comes from it. A little dab goes a long way. You know that commercial we have today? You wouldn't take a whole lot of it. Now go back to your New Testament, to the Gospels. Does anybody remember that somebody had a bottle of perfume? What happened with it? She broke it. And it was in John, I think. What did John say? It was worth like a load of money, but it's filled the entire house. This is the same kind of perfume that we're talking about here. So back, by the way, it comes in Luke 7:36-50, if somebody wants to read it later on. It permeated the house. So back in the Old Testament, a little dab of the scent on Shulamite would be certain to attract Solomon's attention, even if he was sitting at the royal banquet table spread with all the grub in front of him. What is she saying? While the king was at the table or sitting on his couch, the nard that I put on gave forth its fragrance. In other words, he's not going to forget me because I put a little bit on it and I'm going to stay in his attention. She's getting ready to describe how she feels towards him and her love for him by referring to 3 different types of perfume. What do we do today? Women go out and spend all this money on these fancy perfume so they can smell good, so they can get the guy's attention, right? Liz was back there laughing. But anyway, by the way, it was Mary of Bethany, remember, who's the one who broke the nard and then is in there. So Shulamite is passionate about his dignity and how much she respects him, and that his royalty deserves the royal fragrance that just a little dab of that perfume that she would put on her would smell. So not only is she passionate about his dignity, but she's very passionate about his devotion towards her. Now she says in the next verse, a little bundle of, anybody recognize this word? Myrrh is my beloved to me that lies all night between my breasts. Now, she's passionate about his dignity, but now she's also feeling his love of devotion towards her. She does know after he's speaking how much she loves her. And she feels like his love towards her is like a little bag or a little sachet, the ESV calls it, of myrrh that rested on her chest. Let's talk about that. That word myrrh, we usually celebrate that about 3 months ago. We celebrate one of the 3 gifts that was given to Jesus at Christmas by the wise men. But myrrh was a resinous gum, and it came from the South Arabian trees. As a liquid, it was carried in small little bottles like a perfume. But it also could be found in a solid form, in which case, ladies, here's what she's talking about. It would be carried in a little pouch or a sachet that would be worn around the neck, which would probably lay about right here. What do we, you're wearing a necklace today, it would be right here. And that little thing would lay right there. Well, what they would do is they would mix that myrrh with a little bit of fat. That would be, and then when it would get hot, with the body's heat and the sun, it would melt, and as it melted, it would release the fragrance. Now, you don't know this. This is almost MacArthur-esque, but this is Jeremiah writing this down, telling us. It would release the smell that was around her neck, releasing it into the room. Now, by the way, if you bit into it, guess what? It didn't taste good. It was very bitter, but it smelled very rich and lovely. Obviously worth its weight in gold. And certainly, if you go back to Exodus 30, 23 through 33, it was the primary ingredient that was used in the anointing oil that God directed Moses to prepare. So it's very costly, very important. So it had to be worth a lot of money that the wise men bought to Jesus at his birth. But it was also used for smell. So her words, you see, are very sensual. We're not talking sexual stuff here. This is very sensuality. We haven't got to that part. That's coming on down the road. The idea is that the fragrance of the myrrh that she had was another rich reminder of how much she loved him and how much he loved her. And guess where it laid at? It was close to her heart. Can't you just feel the love there? It's here. And that little sachet was worn close to her heart, and just realized that wherever she went, he was close to her heart. Guys, I wish we could write like this. I mean, this is the wisest man who ever lived. And he says, when we do that, the love of the spouse or friends that we have, sometimes the things we have from them are reminders of just how much they mean to us. And she's talking about the spikenard that I have, his fragrance impresses me, but also his devotion to me is a reminder that he's always close to my heart. We'll get a little sentimental there. But now she says, not only that, she's passionate about his dignity and his devotion, but now his distinction. Here's what separates him from the rest. There's some qualities about him that sets him apart. He ain't like every other man. And now she says, my beloved to me is a cluster of henna that blooms in the vineyards of En-Gedi. Anybody ever heard that word before? Anybody remember where we hear about En-Gedi? Old Testament. Who stayed there or hid there? Come a little bit further in time. It had been Solomon's daddy. David hid in the cave of En-Gedi. Remember? Yep. Remember Solomon? I think if you think about it, Saul went in to relieve himself, and he could in there and could have killed him, but didn't do it. And David was down there hiding with all those guys in the cave of En-Gedi. Is that amazing? How's your nugget? Now, En-Gedi lived along En-Gedi lied along the western shore of the Dead Sea. So, if I was a good teacher, I'd have you a picture up here, but I didn't. Now, not only around the Dead Sea were this area, but there was vineyards there. And that's important to her because, she grew up with vineyards in the northern area. And the name of En-Gedi means spring of kid, because guess what grew there? Wild mountain goats. Gotta love goats. They were known today as what we call ibexes. And those goats would find their way down the mountain to the oasis of En-Gedi to drink from its cool springs. The vicinity of the whole area was an arid desert. And as we just said, it was the area where David hid from King Saul in the rocks of the cave. So much of Israel, like the desert around En-Gedi, was a desolate place. But in this little place where she's talking about here was a place that was an oasis. There was a watering hole there. And around that watering hole grew up these little henna plants. It was a blue-black berry, and a white flower would grow from it that had a little fragrance that come from it. I'm going to think it's almost like honeysuckles, but white. And when you walk by, you can smell it. It smells so good. So she's telling him, you are to me like a cluster of henna blossoms. I could, your smell was always there. And the commentary goes into detail. Isn't it amazing how much we've discussed in the first, how many verses we've read? 13, the idea of senses. We've talked about our sight, what he looks like, what he smells like, what he feels like. She wanted to kiss him, what he tastes like. All of those things, the senses are there. And now she's beginning to talk about all of the delights of how he smells. But if you step back at 30,000 feet, and this is radiology, what is she saying here? These plants grew in an oasis in a desert. And she says, I see you, Solomon, as an oasis in a desert of unremarkable men. You are special. You're not like everybody else. The rest of them, they don't pay no mind. But you stand out, just like those flowers stand out in a desert. That oasis stands out. You're my man. I feel you. You're there. And so that idea is just something special to her. So they're really comparing things to each other in the only way they do. He's comparing her to the filly of all of the fillies, and now she's talking about his smells and how he's always there with her, how he loves her, she loves him, and that he is the man of all mans, just those little flowers that stand out in the middle of a desert. Well, what do we take from this? Is it just kind of a little bit of banter going back and forth between the two of those? But how do we take it and extrapolate it to what we need to say as far as the love we have for one another? Well, we're going to take 4 secrets that I think that you can take, not only towards the person you love, and I'm talking to myself, more than not all teaching to you, is taking words of wisdom from the wisest man who ever lived, and we're getting ready to step into, as we close, into some of the other books that this man wrote. Because remember, he's the wisest man who ever lived. Just as the fragrant perfume was being extracted from the plants, the wisdom that we're going to get from not only here and some of Solomon's other writings, how we can intervene and work with other people. Number 1, we'll need to learn to speak sweet words to one another. Somebody turn and read Proverbs 16:24. So now we're going to talk at one of the other great writings that Solomon wrote. And see what Solomon has to tell us, not only from Song of Solomon, but from the Proverbs.
Kind words are like honey, sweet to the soul and healthy for the body.
But so what could be more sweet or refreshing to a person than them being praised and loved? So not only is Solomon telling us that from his love story here in Song of Solomon, but going back to Proverbs that everybody talks about the words of wisdom, he says, a pleasant word from a person's mouth is like honeycomb and sweet to the soul. What is that saying? And I quote sometimes to my clients, and I've always said, you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar, right, Lois? And Solomon's on top of it here. He's learned this to tell his future wife here. He's speaking words of sweetness to her, and she's responding to it. But he also says in Proverbs, sweet words. In his book, A Couple's Guide to Communication, John Gottman says, what really sets married couples apart from strangers is that, unfortunately, married couples are far less polite to each other than other people are. With his or her own spouse, tragically enough, someone is much more likely to interrupt and to criticize and far less likely to offer a compliment than you would to somebody else. And I have a bad habit of that. When she's trying to tell me something, I'll cut her off and not let her finish. So I'm the first to say I'm guilty of that. There is a saying that says a courtship begins when a man whispers sweet nothings, and it ends when he says nothing sweet. Think about all the people, the older you get, that they don't really say nothing out of the way. But I think this works not only in marriage relationships but also in family relationships, church relationships. It's a lot better to say something nice to somebody than to come up here and criticize and say, man, Nancy was the worst on that piano today. She missed every other note. We need to fire her. Or I don't know who cleaned this floor in here, but they didn't do a very good job. How often do we hear that? Solomon said, a sweet word is like honey. And the good things we say certainly should be that way. It should sweeten our language. So the first thing we pick up from Song of Solomon and we pick up from Proverbs is that sweet words, we should speak sweet words to one another. We should also speak soft words, number 2, to one another. Let's go back to Proverbs and let's turn over to 15. You ought to realize that you're going to recognize this one when you see it. Proverbs 15, verse 1.
Okay.
You got it?
Yeah, 15:1.
Mm-hmm.
A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger.
How about that one? Is that true? I mean, sometimes you can calm something down by having a calm word, but if you say the wrong thing, it's like putting a fire, kick it over an anthill. It's going to bust loose everything. Dr. Jeremiah says, why must we be so harsh to people that we love? There's never any genuine excuse considering that a husband who's supposed to love our wife as Christ loves the church, and a wife is supposed to honor her husband as Christ honors the church, to speak words as weapons, use words as weapons. And I say it's the same thing of members of the church, members of the family. We say those things in those ways. And it's not always the words we speak. Sometimes it's the tone of the word that makes the difference. That's why Solomon so wisely counsels us to offer a soft answer, turns away wrath. But a harsh word stirs up anger. Can't you just feel the onomatopoeia there? There's that English word, remember? It sounds like what you got here. Ogden Nash, in one of his writings, says, to keep your marriage brimming with love in the loving cup, whenever you're wrong, admit it, and whenever you're right, shut up. You want me to read that again? That's a pretty good statement, isn't it? To keep your marriage brimming with love in the loving cup, whenever you're wrong, admit it, and whenever you're right, shut up. Watch the tone. Temper the words we say when we say it. He says, watch the way we say it. We speak pleasant words, but we also say soft words. See, we've stepped right out of Song of Solomon, moved right into Proverbs, and you didn't realize how much they tied together. Here's another one, Proverbs 24:26. We're going to speak sensitive words to one another. 24:26. Anybody got it?
This is the lips who gives the right answer.
So the person who gives the right answer is almost like kissing the lips. I love it. He says, you have to admit that's kind of a compelling Bible verse. He says, what does it mean? Soft, sensitive words are as pleasing as a tender kiss. When we say just the right words at just the right time, it's not only good for the person who speaks it, but for the person who hears it. It's just not what you say, but how you say it when it comes to this idea that we're talking about here. The wife asked, do you think this dress looks good on me? It's possible to give a good, honest answer, but to give it with love and sensitivity. Instead of saying, no way, it makes you look fat. You could give her a little hug and say, anything you wear looks good on you, honey. End quote from the commentary. But anyway, we see the idea of speaking sensitive words. Solomon had to write it because he's just taking it and writing it into Proverbs. The right answer is given just like a little kiss on the cheek would be. One more of these. We not only speak words, soft words and sensitive words and sweet words, but we speak words that strengthen one another. One more Proverbs. Proverbs 12:25.
Okay. Anxiety in a man's heart weighs him down, but a good word makes him glad.
Anxiety in the heart of a man causes depression or discouragement, but a good word makes it glad. Here's what the commentary talks a little bit about. He says, ladies, think about it. When your husband's been out busting it all day and works and tired, is anxious when he comes home, it's not the time to hit him up and say, I'm going to tell you what, we ain't got this and we ain't got that. Not the right time. Anxiety in the heart of man causes, but a good word makes it glad. As he walks in the door, he says, isn't that the time that we try to diffuse the situation, use those soft, sensitive words to help the situation? There's a time and a place to say things. Watch your word, because anxiety in the heart can cause discouragement and depression. Here's a suggestion, an old chestnut that never grows old. Honey, I'm so thankful for the way you take care of us. And that goes both ways. The way you can hang tough in a tough world. Respect and adoration towards one another. I take this back as learning how to deal with people. There's some people that know how to are people, and there's some people that ain't. Some people don't have that gene, right, Nancy, that you talk about sometimes. You got to have that gene. The whole idea, 15 different passages talk about encouragement. Paul was all about it. And we know who the great encourager in the New Testament was, certainly was none other than Barnabas himself. So one of the things, as we finish this section up tonight, we talk about two less different things. It's creating the perfect relationship with people. We know that nothing is ever perfect, but we can create in our minds because we're treated how we're treated. And I told the story last week, but I'm going to tell it again because maybe some didn't follow. It was told by a guy named Ted Ingston. He was a leader of the Youth for Christ International and World Vision. And he's talked about Joe, who was thoroughly sick of his wife after only 3 years of marriage. Didn't last very long, huh? She gained weight, so he wasn't attracted to her anymore. He didn't even find her likable. And he now was expressing his resentment to the psychiatrist that he wanted her to pay her back for the way she had made his life miserable. He went and met with his divorce lawyer, but took one more step before the papers were to be served, a kind of a coup de grace as a parting gesture. He met with his old buddy, the psychiatrist, and said, I want to know how to make her life as miserable as I can before I divorce her. Psychiatrist says, well, okay, Joe, here's what I want you to do. I want you to go home tonight and treat her as if she were a goddess. That's right, a goddess. I want you to veer 180 degrees from how you're feeling and how you've been treating her. Make every moment a mission dedicated to her deepest pleasure. Listen to everything she says as if it's the most important thing in the world. When you see her doing housework, get up and outwork her. Take her out to dinner. Not only just to the Taco Bell, but to the best place in town. And treat her like she's a goddess. Remember, she's going to be your goddess. I want you to do that for 2 months. Well, Joe said, all right, what comes next? Just when she's on cloud 9, walk out, pack your bags, tell her it's over and hit the road. And you'll just ruin her. Whew, man, Joe says, that's kind of ruthless, but it will be devastating. With great relish, Joe got up and put that devious plan into motion. He treated her as if the moon, sun, and stars revolved around her. Breakfast in bed, dozen roses at unexpected moments, gourmet restaurants, trips to the theater. Joe even had to learn to have dishpan hands. When she would drift off to sleep, sometimes he was reading books to her. Then there were several different getaways to different trips and vacations. Best of all, from her perspective, Joe was listening to her. And she had never felt more attention and more empathy. She had absolutely no idea what was going on in his mind. Well, inevitably, after a couple of months, the psychiatrist called him in and said, hey, Joe, are you a bachelor yet? Have you got your divorce? Divorce, Joe said, as if the idea was strange to him. Are you crazy? Why would I file a divorce? I'm married to a goddess. The truth is, what we come from that story is, when we positively treat other people the way Solomon was treating Shulamite, it reflects on how we feel that person and how they reflect back to us. We shape one another by the way we teach, the words we use and the things we say, just the way Solomon was saying to her. C.S. Lewis once gave an address that was entitled The Way to Glory, that asked, now here's some deepness, whether we are ready for the challenge of carrying the burden of each other's final glory, which is our spiritual destination. Are we constantly helping one another, small act by small act, towards becoming the godly creature that we're supposed to do with one another? Obviously more for men who were supposed to be the head of household. Are we taking that idea and bringing the household closer to God or driving them away? Certainly the idea that C.S. Lewis would ask, are we willing to bear the weight of another person's glory? That's a C.S. Lewis thought. So we end this with this tonight is the key is Solomon and Shulamite have this mutual affection towards one another, and they were doing their best to build each one another up, to experience the joy of being in a relationship with one another. It's kind of like taking two different pianos and tuning them to the same tuning fork. And ultimately, we know, as Dr. Jeremiah says, to remind people that if you don't have God in the center of your relationship, that's the missing point, because you can't take two tuning forks and tune them unless you got something to tune them to. And certainly that's the relationship with the Lord. And the idea that we come from the language of love that Solomon and Shulamite for teaching us is to use words wisely in our relationship. Next week, as we pick up into chapter 2, we'll finish 2 verses in chapter 1 and then move into chapter 2. We're going to talk about being lovesick. Anybody ever been lovesick? Can't eat, can't sleep. Lovesick and love healthy. Because she's going to be lovesick, and then we're going to find out that she's actually feels healthy because she's in love. So that's where we'll pick up next week as the relationship continues to grow. And then the following week, we're going to talk about the quest for the perfect mate as we're moving in the right direction. See, this is not as bad as those people thought it was. It's a good book. Of course, I'm trying to make it as entertaining as we can by adding those things. Certainly the stories are good. And next week, be prepared to tell stories about being lovesick.
I'll be able to, because he will have been gone for 3 days.
That's right.
We've never been apart.
Well, you will be remember what we talked about last week about the pillow without the smell, huh?
Next week is the 31st, last day of the month.
Yep.
Wow.
So, does anybody have anything to add to it? Any reflections they had as they were going through it? But it's a little bit different. But certainly it's in the Word, and certainly I tried to take it and apply it not only to people that are married and in love, but we have other relationships too, with like children and grandchildren and friends, relationships in the church that really can use a lot of this wisdom that Solomon would have. If more people went by that, probably we'd have a lot less church splits.
I think a lot of it is true to fact. We just, as time progresses, when we get older and get busy with our lives, we just tend to forget. Because every now and then, my husband will call me the nickname that he gave me when we were, first dating, like I said, in love,
Right.
home, love sick and everything else. And every now and then I'll say it to him, he just giggles and laughs, But I think a lot of it is just true to fact, and we move forward and we forget, we get busy, and I left a note for him 3 weeks ago, I left a note for him at the house 3 weeks ago when I was in the hospital, and he found it the other day, and he was like, "What is this?" And he just kind of giggled, and it wasn't anything major, it was
Right.
just,
It's the little things.
yeah, just the little things, they always seem to matter.
And I'm beginning to think now that if you step back at 30,000, little Rodney knowledge here, maybe that's why God put this in the Bible, is that we get so caught up in the everyday lives of business. I'd say you get caught up in church business, but work business and everyday life, if you got children and grandchildren, that adds to it, that you forget those little things that Solomon and Shulamite are reminding us that really kicked everything in gear. The little notes to call them the pet names, just that simple say, "Baby, I love you."
We know it in our hearts, but we forget to say it.
And I think that's the idea of what needs to be said here. So, anything else? Better than you thought it was going to be, huh? I told you would enjoy it. Love sick and love healthy next week. We'll close with prayer. Father, once again, thank you for, Lord, it's an interesting study, a different study than what we're used to. The narrative, the history, the things that we've studied, the doctrine. But certainly as we begin to look back and see, I think it's beginning to play is that, as Elizabeth said, when we get too busy, we forget the things that really drove us towards the people we love, whether it's our spouse, whether our children, our brothers or sisters, our family, mothers, parents, or just friends and family and loved ones in the church. We forget the things that drew us close to one another. And certainly, I think you can say it's close to our relationship with you, that we get too busy that we forget to pray, we forget to talk to you, we forget to say the words that we need to say. And I really believe that's why you put it in the Bible, to let us realize these words and to let us understand Solomon, who's the wisest man who ever lived, is telling us not forget the soft words, the not only things we say, but the way we say it. Maybe take these things to heart and use it in our relationships, not only with our loved ones, but our family and our friends, and even those that maybe we don't get along with, to use it to better them and draw them closer to you, who's actually the ultimate lover. As we said, many people think this book is certainly an allegory of you. And certainly we could see how in our relationship with you, we could get too busy to spend time reading or talking with you. May we spend more time with you, drawing closer to you and with our loved ones. We thank you for the privilege it is here. We ask for blessing for those who couldn't be here tonight. We pray for those who are sick, those who have come out of surgery, those who've lost loved ones. We pray to be the God of comfort, the God of peace, the God of second chances, the God of whatever we need to be. You said you were, I am. We certainly pray for all those who couldn't be here and those who are following along. We lift up this church. We lift up all the churches represented here, all the pastors represented here, those around us, that you'd be with those as they would teach the truth. We pray for our nation, our leaders, that they would lead us in the right direction. We certainly pray for those people in the war-torn countries over in Europe, that you'd be with those and that you would protect those, especially your church there and the innocent, that you would bring a peaceful situation there as soon as you can. We pray for our military who's protecting us, who are over there, that you keep them out of harm's way, and certainly for our missionaries out on foreign soil. And we thank you for giving us your word, knowing that everything in it was because you loved us, the ultimate lover that loved us from the foundation of the world and on into the future, because you've loved us. You always have, and you always will. Amen. Next week, love sick. I love the commentary to begin.